I am a woman in my 50s now, living a life of faith and gratitude. But my story begins when I was just a little girl. My name is Layla, and I grew up in a loving Muslim household. We lived simply, but with strong values rooted in our faith. My parents taught me the importance of devotion, kindness, and trusting in Allah. I remember our home filled with the sounds of my mother's prayers and my father's gentle voice teaching me to recite verses from the Quran. It was a peaceful and predictable life, and I felt safe within it. When I was 7 years old, my world began to change. What started as a mild illness quickly turned into something far more serious. I grew weak, and soon I couldn't even stand. My mother hovered over me, wiping my forehead with a cool cloth, whispering prayers of healing and hope. My father was less vocal, but his worry was plain to see. He consulted doctors and sought advice from the imam, who came to our home to pray over me, yet nothing seemed to help. The fever consumed me. My body ached and my chest burned with every breath. I was too young to understand the gravity of my condition, but I could see it in my parents' faces. They were terrified. My mother clutched my hand tightly, as if her love alone could anchor me to the world. "Layla, my precious girl, stay with us," she would say, her voice trembling with desperation. The days blurred together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. My family's prayers grew more urgent, their hope more fragile. I remember my father pacing the room, his hands clasped tightly as if holding on to faith itself. The imam reassured them that Allah's will would prevail, but I could sense their fear of losing me. One night, as the fever raged and my body grew weaker, I felt something shift. It was as if the weight of the world was lifting off me. The pain dulled, the room seemed to dim, and the voices of my parents faded into the background. I was still there, but I wasn't. It's hard to explain, even now. It felt like I was floating, detached from the tiny, frail body lying on the bed below. I could see my parents, their faces wet with tears. My mother was calling my name, her hands gently shaking my shoulders, while my father stood nearby, frozen in helplessness. It was strange to watch them from above, to see their anguish and feel so removed from it. I wanted to reach out and comfort them, to tell them I was okay, but I couldn't. I was no longer in control. That's when I noticed the light. It wasn't just light, it was warmth, comfort, and love all rolled into one. It seemed to fill the space, emanating from somewhere beyond my sight. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but soft and inviting. I had never seen or felt anything like it before. It drew me in with an undeniable pull, yet it didn't feel forceful. It was as though it were waiting for me to choose, to take the first step toward it. At first, I hesitated. I thought of my parents, of how devastated they would be if I left them. Their prayers and their love were still echoing around me. Was it wrong to move toward this light? Was I abandoning them? These questions filled my young mind, creating a tension between my longing to stay and the peace that the light promised. But the light didn't demand or pressure me. Instead, it seemed to whisper, not with words, but with a feeling, "Come closer, you are safe." The warmth of it was irresistible, like a loving embrace. For the first time in days, I felt no pain, no fear, just an overwhelming sense of peace. As I moved toward the light, I began to sense that someone or something was waiting for me. I felt a presence, strong and loving, unlike anything I had ever known. It was as if this presence understood everything about me, my fears, my hopes, even the prayers my parents had whispered over my fevered body. It knew me completely and loved me unconditionally. This was a moment of profound awe for me, even as a child. The light grew brighter and the presence became clearer. I felt myself being drawn into something extraordinary, something beyond my comprehension. My journey was only just beginning. I remember the exact moment I left my body. It's something I'll never forget, no matter how many years have passed. One moment, I was lying in bed, burning with fever, my little hands limp in my mother's desperate grip. The next, I was floating above it all, watching the scene as if I were a bystander to my own life. It was surreal, terrifying, and oddly peaceful all at once. From above, I could see my parents, their faces etched with despair. My mother's tears fell onto my lifeless cheeks as she whispered prayers I couldn't quite make out. My father stood just behind her, his lips moving in silent supplication. I saw my siblings huddled near the doorway, their eyes wide with fear, their small hands clasped together as if holding on to each other could somehow make this nightmare go away. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was still here, that I wasn't gone, but no sound came out. I reached out, or at least I thought I did, but there was no physicality to me. I had no arms, no voice, just a consciousness, floating in the space between their heartbreak and my own confusion. It was like being untethered, free but not yet understanding the depth of what that meant. Then it happened. At first, it was a faint glow in the corner of the room, barely noticeable against the dim light of the bedside lamp, but it grew brighter, more radiant, until it seemed to fill the entire space. It wasn't a harsh or blinding light. It was soft, warm, and impossibly inviting. I had never seen anything like it, not in my prayers, not in my dreams. It wasn't just a light. It felt alive. It felt like love. The light seemed to beckon me, not with words, but with an irresistible pull. I didn't walk or float toward it. I was simply drawn, as though it knew me, as though it had been waiting for me. For the first time in days, I felt no pain, no weakness, only a profound sense of comfort. It was as if the light itself was wrapping around me, holding me in a way I couldn't describe, but instinctively understood. I glanced back at my family, at the little body lying motionless on the bed. It was strange to see myself like that, so small and fragile, like a doll someone had put aside. I could feel their pain, their grief, but it was distant now, as though it belonged to a different world. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the pull of the light and the love anchoring me to my family. Was it selfish to leave? Would they forgive me? But the light didn't rush me. It waited, patient and understanding, as if it knew this was a decision I needed to make on my own. It didn't demand or pressure. It simply existed, offering peace and a promise of something greater. I felt a whisper, not in words, but in my heart. It's okay. You're safe. I let go, not of my family, not of love, but of the fear. I let the light take me, trusting it in a way I had never trusted anything before. As I moved closer, the room behind me began to fade. The sounds of my mother's sobs and my father's prayers grew quieter until they were nothing but a distant hum. The light enveloped me completely, and with it came a sensation that I can only describe as pure peace. It was like stepping into a warm embrace, like being wrapped in a love so complete it erased every worry, every fear, every doubt. The closer I got, the more I felt an undeniable presence within the light. It wasn't just a force, it was someone who knew me, who loved me, who had been waiting for me. I couldn't see a face yet, but I could feel them. It was as though every part of me, my thoughts, my feelings, my very soul, was known and cherished. It was overwhelming and humbling, and for the first time in my young life, I felt truly seen. I wanted to ask questions, but I couldn't find the words. It didn't matter. Somehow, I knew that all my questions would be answered in time. I continued moving toward the presence, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace growing within me. I wasn't scared anymore. I didn't know where I was going, but I trusted that it was somewhere I was meant to be. And then, just as I was about to fully step into this new realm, the light grew even brighter, and I felt myself being pulled into something extraordinary. It was a moment of complete surrender, and I knew that whatever lay ahead would change everything I thought I knew. I stepped deeper into the light, feeling its warmth envelop me completely. It wasn't blinding, though it was brighter than anything I had ever seen. The light carried a presence with it, one that made me feel more alive than I had ever felt before. And then, from the brilliance, a figure began to emerge. At first, I saw nothing but an outline, a shape that seemed both human and beyond human at the same time. But as he stepped forward, the features became clear. It was him, Jesus. I didn't need anyone to tell me who he was. I just knew. His presence radiated a love so pure, so overwhelming, that it made me want to cry and laugh at the same time. He spoke my name, Aisha. The way he said it, it was as though he had always known me, not just my name, but my thoughts, my heart, my entire being. In that moment, I felt completely seen, not just as a little girl, but as someone who mattered deeply to him. Aisha, he said again, his voice carrying a warmth that melted away every fear I had. You've been so brave. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to understand how this was possible. How could Jesus be here in this place? How could he know me, a girl who had never been taught to call him her Savior? I had always learned that Jesus was a prophet, a respected figure, but nothing more. Yet standing before him now, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Why am I here? I finally managed to ask. My voice sounded small, even to me. You are here because I love you, he said simply, his eyes locking with mine. You've always been mine, Aisha, even when you didn't know it. Tears welled up in my eyes. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, that made it impossible to doubt him. Still, part of me resisted. How could this fit with everything I had been taught? I had grown up believing in a different path, a different understanding of God. Was I wrong all along? Jesus seemed to sense my inner turmoil. He knelt down to meet me at eye level, his expression gentle yet serious. "You've always sought the truth," he said, "and I am the truth, the love you've known, the faith you've practiced. It was never wrong, but there is more, and I want you to see it." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "But how can this be? My family, my prayers, everything we've believed, are you saying it wasn't real?" He shook his head, his gaze never leaving mine. "Your prayers were heard, Aisha. Your faith was genuine. But there is a greater truth, one that fulfills everything you've ever longed for. It's not about what was wrong, but about what is complete." As he spoke, images began to appear around us, as if the light itself was painting scenes for me to see. I saw moments from my own life, times when I prayed for guidance, times when I felt lost or afraid. In each of those moments, I realized now he had been there. And then the scene shifted. I saw stories I had only vaguely heard before, moments from the Bible. I saw Jesus healing the sick, feeding the hungry, comforting the brokenhearted. I saw him on the cross, his face filled with both pain and love, and I couldn't look away. It was as though I were there, standing at the foot of the cross, feeling the weight of what he was doing. "Why?" I whispered, the tears streaming down my face now. "Why would you do that?" "Because I love you," he said again, his voice steady and sure. "And because love is the only way to truly save the world." I didn't understand everything he was showing me, but I felt the truth of it deep in my heart. He wasn't just a prophet. He wasn't just a teacher. He was something far greater. He was the answer to questions I hadn't even known I was asking. "But I don't deserve this," I said, my voice trembling. "I haven't lived a perfect life. I've doubted. I've made mistakes." "You don't need to be perfect," he interrupted gently. "Grace is not something you earn, Aisha. It's a gift, freely given. And it's for you just as much as anyone else." The idea of grace was foreign to me. I had grown up believing that everything depended on how good I was, how faithful, how obedient. But here he was, offering me something I couldn't earn, something I didn't deserve, simply because he loved me. I felt a warmth spread through me, a peace I had never known before. It was as if all the weight I had been carrying, my fears, my doubts, my need to be enough, was being lifted off me. For the first time, I felt free. "Do you trust me, Aisha?" Jesus asked, his eyes searching mine. I nodded slowly, not because I fully understood, but because I wanted to. I wanted to trust him, to believe that everything he was saying was true. "Then come with me," he said, standing and extending his hand. "There's more I want to show you." I reached out and took his hand, feeling a strength and love in his touch that made me feel like I could do anything. As the light around us began to shift again, I knew that whatever lay ahead, it would change me forever. As I held Jesus' hand, the light around us began to shift once more, I was no longer standing in the warm glow, but instead found myself in a vast, indescribable realm. It felt like I was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The air carried a feeling of profound peace, but there was also an undertone of something urgent, as if I were about to learn a truth too immense for words. Suddenly, the scene before me transformed. I stood at the edge of a breathtaking place, heaven. It wasn't just beautiful, it was perfect. There were no words to capture the colors, the sounds, or the overwhelming sense of joy that radiated from every corner. The light here wasn't just light, it was alive, wrapping me in warmth and love, making me feel as though I belonged. I saw people, countless people, their faces glowing with peace and happiness. They weren't strangers. Somehow I knew them. They were laughing, singing, and radiating a love that seemed to flow directly from God Himself. The most incredible part was the presence I felt, a presence greater than even Jesus standing beside me. It was God. It was as though His love was the very fabric of this place, binding everything together in perfect harmony. "This is heaven," Jesus said, His voice filled with both pride and tenderness. "This is what I have prepared for those who accept my grace." I couldn't speak. My heart ached with a longing to stay, to remain in this perfect place forever. But before I could fully take it in, the scene shifted again. This time it was darker, heavier. I was now standing in a place I didn't want to be, a place I could barely look at. It was hell. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. Where heaven had been filled with light and unity, hell was filled with darkness and despair. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of hope, of love, of anything good. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though it carried the weight of every regret and sorrow imaginable. I saw people here too, but they weren't glowing with joy. They were crying out, their faces etched with pain and regret. Their voices carried a haunting sadness, a longing for something they couldn't have. They weren't being tortured in the way I had seen in movies or imagined as a child. Instead, they were tormented by the overwhelming knowledge that they had chosen to reject God's love, to turn away from the grace that had been freely offered to them. I couldn't bear to look, but Jesus didn't let me turn away. "This is the reality of separation from God," He said, His voice filled with sorrow. "It's not a punishment I inflict. It's the result of rejecting the love and grace that I offer." Tears streamed down my face as I looked at the people there. I wanted to reach out to them, to help them, but I knew I couldn't. Their choices had been made, and now they were living with the consequences. The weight of it all crushed me, and I turned to Jesus, my voice trembling. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to understand the power of grace," He said, His eyes filled with compassion. "You've been taught that salvation comes through works, through earning God's favor. But grace is not something you can earn, Aisha. It's a gift I freely give to all who will accept it." Grace. The word felt foreign to me, but as Jesus spoke, I began to understand. Grace wasn't about being good enough or doing enough. It wasn't about earning love or forgiveness. It was about receiving it freely and humbly because God loved us enough to give it. But why me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why would you give this to me? Because I love you, he said simply. And because you have a purpose, Aisha. Your life is not an accident, and your pain has not been in vain. I have a plan for you, one that will bring hope and light to others. His words washed over me, filling me with a sense of peace and purpose I had never known before. For so long, I had believed that my worth was tied to what I did, to how well I followed the rules and lived out my faith. But here, in the presence of Jesus, I realized that my worth had nothing to do with what I had done and everything to do with who he was. He held out his hand to me once more. Aisha, will you accept my grace? Will you let me lead you? Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. Yes, I said, my voice breaking. Yes, I will. The moment I said those words, I felt a warmth spread through me, a lightness that lifted every burden I had ever carried. It was as though every mistake, every fear, every doubt had been washed away, leaving only love and peace in their place. I felt new, whole, for the first time in my life. Jesus smiled, and the light around us seemed to grow brighter. It's time to go back now, he said, his voice filled with both love and sadness. There's more for you to do. I felt my heart sink at the thought of leaving, of stepping away from this perfect place. But I don't want to leave, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said gently, but your story isn't over yet. What you've seen here, what you've experienced, it's meant to be shared. There are people who need to hear it, who need to know that my grace is for them too. As he spoke, I felt a deep sense of purpose settle over me. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew that I had been changed forever. And as the light around me began to fade, I held on to his promise, knowing that my life would never be the same. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the tear-streaked faces of my family surrounding my bed. My mother was holding my hand, her lips moving silently in prayer, and my father stood just behind her, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, I didn't understand what had happened. The vivid experience I just had felt more real than the hospital room I now found myself in. Aisha, my mother whispered, her voice trembling. Can you hear me? I nodded weakly, and the room erupted in sobs of relief. My siblings hugged each other, their prayers answered, while the doctors and nurses exchanged astonished glances. I could hear snippets of their conversation, words like impossible and miraculous. I tried to sit up, but my body felt light, as though I wasn't fully tethered to it yet. The memory of the light of Jesus' presence was still fresh in my mind. I could feel the peace he had given me lingering in my heart, but I didn't know how to explain it to anyone. How could I possibly put into words what I had just seen, what I had just experienced? My father leaned in, his hand trembling as he touched my cheek. You were gone, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The doctors said, they said there was no hope. I looked at him, tears filling my eyes. I'm here, I whispered. I'm okay. But I wasn't just okay. As the minutes passed and I became more aware of my surroundings, I realized something extraordinary, something no one could explain. The pain that had plagued me for months, the sickness that had left me frail and weak, was completely gone. I felt whole, strong, as though my body had been renewed. The doctors ran tests, poking and prodding, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. My mother asked 100 questions, her voice swinging between joy and desperation. "Are you sure? How could this happen? Is it really gone?" Finally, the doctor shook his head, his face pale with disbelief. "There's no trace of the illness," he said. "It's as if it was never there." The room went silent as everyone processed his words. My mother began to cry again, this time tears of joy, while my father dropped to his knees, thanking God for what he believed was a divine intervention. I wanted to tell them they were right, that it was a miracle, but I couldn't bring myself to say it, not yet. As the days passed, the news of my recovery spread through our community. Friends and relatives came to visit, bringing flowers and food, their faces full of curiosity and wonder. Everyone wanted to know how it had happened, but I stayed quiet, offering only a vague smile when they pressed me for answers. How could I tell them the truth? How could I explain that I had met Jesus, that he had healed me, that he had given me a message I couldn't yet put into words? The truth felt too big, too overwhelming to share. I was afraid of how my family would react, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of what this revelation would mean for my life. I had been raised to believe that Jesus was a prophet, a respected figure, but not the Son of God. To say otherwise would be seen as a betrayal of everything my family and community stood for. And yet, I couldn't deny what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his love, heard his voice telling me I had a purpose. The memory of his words echoed in my mind, filling me with both peace and uncertainty. "Your story isn't over," he had said. "There is more for you to do." But what did that mean? What was I supposed to do? How could I fulfill the purpose he had given me when I didn't even know where to begin? At night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, I would sit by the window and pray. Not the prayers I had been taught as a child, but new prayers, simple, heartfelt conversations with Jesus. I didn't have the right words, but I knew he was listening. I asked him for guidance, for courage, for the strength to face whatever lay ahead. One night, as I sat there in the darkness, I felt a peace wash over me, the same peace I had felt in his presence. It was as though he was reminding me that I wasn't alone, that he was with me every step of the way. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. What I had experienced wasn't just for me, it was for others too, but I wasn't ready, not yet. For now, I decided I would keep my encounter a secret. I would take the time to process what had happened, to learn more about Jesus and the message he had given me. I needed to understand it fully before I could share it with anyone else. But even as I made that decision, I knew it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. The changes in me were too obvious to hide. My family could see it in the way I carried myself, in the peace that seemed to radiate from me. My friends noticed it too, asking why I seemed so calm, so different. And I was different. The fear that had once consumed me was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence I couldn't explain. The anger and frustration I had felt during my illness had melted away, leaving only gratitude and hope. And though I still had questions, still wrestled with doubts, I knew one thing for certain: Jesus had saved me, both my body and my soul. As I sat by the window that night, watching the stars, I whispered a prayer of thanks. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling. "Thank you for giving me another chance. Thank you for showing me the truth. Help me to share it when the time is right." And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I felt a quiet assurance in my heart, a promise that when the time came, He would give me the words to say. When the house was silent, I would sit by the dim glow of a bedside lamp with the Bible I'd secretly borrowed from a trusted friend. The book felt foreign in my hands, but its words spoke to a part of me I hadn't realized was hungry. My encounter with Jesus had left me with questions that I couldn't ignore, and every page I turned seemed to hold answers I had been unknowingly searching for my entire life. I found myself drawn to His teachings about love, grace, and forgiveness. They were so different from the strict rules I had grown up with. In my childhood faith, I had believed in a God who required constant striving and perfection, but here was Jesus, offering grace freely to anyone who would accept it. The thought was both comforting and overwhelming. Could it really be that simple? Each night, I would read more, feeling both excited and conflicted. I didn't know how to reconcile what I was learning with the beliefs I had been taught since birth. I kept asking myself if I was betraying my family, my community, and everything I had once held dear. But the memory of Jesus' face, His voice, His love, it was undeniable. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, no matter how much I feared the consequences. Eventually, the weight of keeping everything bottled up became too much. I knew I needed to share my story with someone, but I wasn't sure who I could trust. After much prayer and thought, I decided to confide in my childhood friend Layla. She had always been a safe place for me, someone who listened without judgment. One afternoon, while we were sitting in her living room sipping tea, I hesitated before speaking. "Layla," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something, but I'm scared." She set her cup down, her eyes full of concern. "What is it, Aisha? You can tell me anything." I took a deep breath and began to share everything: the illness, the moment I left my body, the light, meeting Jesus, and the miraculous healing. I watched her expression shift from confusion to astonishment as I spoke, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process what I was saying. When I finished, there was a long silence. I braced myself for her reaction, my heart pounding. "Aisha," she finally said, her voice trembling, "that's incredible. But Jesus, are you sure?" I nodded, tears filling my eyes. "I know it sounds impossible, but it happened. I can't explain it, but I know it was Him. He spoke to me, Layla. He told me things I can't ignore." Layla sat back, shaking her head. "I don't know what to say. This is a lot to take in. But I believe you, Aisha. I've known you my whole life, and I know you wouldn't make something like this up." Her words were a balm to my soul. For the first time, I felt a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in this. Encouraged by Layla's support, I began to take small steps toward exploring my newfound faith more openly. I reached out to a local Christian community, attending their gatherings in secret. The first time I walked into a church, my heart raced with a mix of fear and curiosity. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the warmth of the people there immediately put me at ease. They welcomed me without hesitation, their smiles genuine and their kindness overwhelming. As I listened to the pastor speak about Jesus' love and sacrifice, I felt tears streaming down my face. It was as though he was speaking directly to me, confirming everything Jesus had shown me during my NDE. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen and understood, not by people, but by God Himself. Over the next few weeks, I attended more gatherings, quietly observing and learning. I met people who shared their own stories of faith and transformation, and their courage inspired me. They didn't judge me for my background or my questions. Instead, they embraced me with open arms, showing me what it meant to live out the love of Christ. But even as I grew in my understanding and faith, I knew I couldn't keep my journey hidden forever. The thought of telling my family and community filled me with dread. I knew the risks. I could be ostracized, shamed, or even disowned. Yet, I also knew I couldn't deny what had happened to me. Jesus had given me a new purpose, and keeping it a secret felt like burying a light that was meant to shine. One evening, as I sat in my room holding the Bible, I prayed for guidance. "Lord," I whispered, "I'm so afraid. I don't know how they'll react, but I know I need to tell them. Please give me the strength to speak the truth, no matter what happens." A sense of peace washed over me, and I knew it was time. The next morning, I asked my family to gather in the living room. My parents, siblings, and even a few extended relatives were there, their faces curious and concerned. They had noticed the changes in me, the way I carried myself with a newfound calm and confidence, but they didn't know the reason why. I stood before them, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. "I need to tell you something," I began. "It's about what happened to me when I was sick. There's something I've been keeping from you, but I can't keep it to myself any longer." As I shared my story, I saw a range of emotions cross their faces: shock, disbelief, anger, and even fear. My father's brow furrowed, and my mother's eyes filled with tears. My siblings exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say. When I finished, the room fell silent. My father was the first to speak. "Aisha," he said, his voice strained, "what you're saying, it goes against everything we believe. How can you turn your back on your faith, your family?" I looked at him, my heart breaking. "I'm not turning my back on you," I said softly. "I love you all so much, but I can't deny what happened. Jesus saved me, He healed me, and He showed me the truth. I can't keep that to myself." My mother wept openly, and my siblings remained silent, their expressions a mixture of confusion and sadness. I knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, But I also knew I wasn't alone. Jesus had given me the courage to speak, and I trusted him to guide me through whatever came next. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt both a weight and a sense of freedom. The truth was out, and though I didn't know how my family would respond in the long term, I was at peace, knowing I had taken the first step. The road ahead would be challenging, but I was ready to walk it, one step at a time with Jesus by my side. Fully committing my life to Jesus wasn't a single moment. It was a journey of trust, surrender, and a deepening understanding of the grace he offers. After my encounter with him, every part of my life began to shift. My priorities changed, my relationships transformed, and the way I viewed the world became profoundly different. I was no longer the same person, and while the transformation brought immense peace, it also came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. As I embraced Jesus as my Savior, I felt a profound sense of belonging that I'd never experienced before. His love was unconditional, His grace boundless, and His presence constant. I spent hours in prayer, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to grow closer to Him. The Bible became my guide, a source of wisdom and comfort. Passages I once skimmed over now came alive, speaking directly to my heart. I finally understood what it meant to be truly free, not bound by rules or expectations, but free in the grace of God. However, this new path wasn't without its difficulties. Some of my family members, though initially supportive of my recovery, began to distance themselves as they realized the depth of my commitment to Jesus. My father, who had always been my rock, struggled the most. He couldn't understand how I could abandon the faith of our ancestors. His words were sharp, his disappointment palpable, and it hurt more than I could express. "I raised you better than this, Aisha," he said one evening, his voice heavy with emotion. "This isn't who you are." I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes. "I know this is hard for you to understand, Baba, but I'm not abandoning you or our family. I'm following the truth I've been shown. Jesus saved me. I can't ignore that." His silence was deafening, and for weeks our conversations became strained. My siblings were more open-minded, though cautious. Some were curious, asking me questions about Jesus and the Bible. Others remained silent, watching from the sidelines, unsure of how to engage. My mother was torn, caught between her love for me and her fear of what the community might say. The community reaction was swift and unforgiving. Whispers spread, and people began to look at me differently. Invitations to gatherings stopped, and some lifelong friends avoided me altogether. It was a lonely season, but I clung to the promise Jesus had given me, that I was never truly alone. Amid the rejection, there were glimmers of hope. A few close friends stood by me, offering encouragement and love. They didn't fully understand my journey, but they respected it. Their support gave me the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path was difficult. Sharing my story publicly was a decision I didn't take lightly. I knew it would invite criticism and judgment, but I also knew it was what Jesus had called me to do. The first time I stood before a group to share my testimony, my hands trembled and my heart raced. I spoke about my illness, my near-death experience, and the overwhelming love I felt in Jesus' presence. I shared how He had healed me physically and spiritually, and how His grace had transformed my life. The room was silent as I spoke, the audience hanging on every word. When I finished, there was a long pause before someone finally broke the silence. "Thank you," a woman said, tears streaming down her face. "Your story has given me hope." From that moment on, I knew my mission was to share the love and grace of Jesus with as many people as possible. I began speaking at churches, community centers, and even small gatherings in people's homes. Each time, I was met with a mix of reactions, some skeptical, some moved, and others eager to learn more. But what mattered most was that seeds were being planted. I wasn't responsible for changing hearts. That was God's work. My role was simply to share the truth He had revealed to me. As I shared my story, I found that it wasn't just about telling others what had happened. It was about connecting with them on a deeply human level. I listened to their doubts, fears, and questions. I shared their struggles and rejoiced in their victories. I wasn't just a storyteller. I was a witness to God's grace, living proof of His transformative power. Reconciliation with my family was slow but steady. My father, though still hesitant, began to see the joy and peace my faith brought me. "You're different," he said one day, his tone softer than it had been in months. "You're happier." "I am, Baba," I replied, "because I found the truth. And I pray that one day you'll see it too." My mother, ever the peacemaker, began asking me quiet questions about Jesus when no one else was around. She didn't say much, but her curiosity gave me hope. Through it all, I leaned on my new spiritual family, my church community. They became my source of strength, encouragement, and accountability. They walked with me through the highs and lows, reminding me of God's promises when I felt weak. Looking back, I see how every step of my journey was orchestrated by God. From my illness to my encounter with Jesus, to the challenges and triumphs that followed, He was with me every step of the way. What once felt like a burden now feels like a blessing. A story meant to be shared, a life meant to inspire others. As I reflect on this journey, I can't help but marvel at God's grace. He took a scared little girl, gave her a second chance at life, and turned her into a messenger of His love. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that God's plans are always greater than our own. His love is boundless, His grace unending, and His truth life-changing. To anyone listening to my story, I want to say this. Don't be afraid to seek the truth, even if it challenges everything you've ever known. God's love is for everyone, no matter where you come from or what you've done. He's waiting for you, just as He was waiting for me. If you're searching for answers, if you're feeling lost or unsure, I encourage you to open your heart to Jesus. He changed my life in ways I could never have imagined, and I know He can do the same for you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it has touched you in any way, I invite you to share your thoughts, leave your prayer requests, or explore other NDE testimonies. Let's continue this journey of faith together, trusting in the one who makes all things new